obvious. The obvious thing is that life in the wilderness is difficult. Life in the wilderness is difficult. The food was scarce, the water was scarce, and besides, this was a big group of people, a group of Israelites wandering in the wilderness. We don't know how exactly to read ancient human or ancient Hebrew numbers, but the guess is that there were maybe 500,000 people, maybe more. This is a lot of people. And when they came up out of Egypt, everybody came. The old people, the sick people, the babies, the young people, everybody came. So it was a whole cluster of all kinds of people. And they left Egypt in a hurry, you remember. You can read the story in the opening chapters of the book of Exodus. They left Egypt in a hurry, and it's been about 2 months now since they left Egypt. They brought with them, literally, what they could carry on their back, and that was it. And there was no supply chain. There were no tractor trailers full of supplies heading on ahead of them in the desert so they would have stuff when they got to the next place. There was no supply chain. The whole thing was really very makeshift. And the leadership had never done anything like this. Moses and his brother Aaron, they were altogether inexperienced at this sort of thing. And so on a good day, all of this felt kind of tenuous, and not every day was a good day. Hard times have a way of messing with our heads. You know what I mean, because you've had hard times, and so have I. Hard times have a way of messing with our heads. We get sick and tired of the way things are. We get hungry for something different. It feels like we're starving to death. Maybe not literally, physically starving to death, but our hearts are starving to death. Our emotions are starving to death. Our relationships. It's a deadly kind of a time. Hard times mess with our heads. And they incline us often to look back then, back to the good old days, which suddenly seemed incredibly good, probably a whole lot better than they really were back then, but nonetheless, we think back to the good old days, and then we start to complain. We get a little grumpy about our predicament, and what Israel was saying could very well be the words that would come out of our mouths. Why didn't God just kill us off back there in Egypt? Why is God dragging us out here and putting us through all of this crazy stuff we're going through? And this is on the beginning of it. They really had no idea how many more years of this they had ahead of them. This was going to go on for 40 years. You remember the story. They didn't know that at the beginning. Moses, why did you bring us out here? Did you bring us out here into this wilderness so you could starve us to death? Where's your plan, Moses? Where's your leadership ability? Bottom line, where is your God? Where is the source of your power? Where is the source of your authority? Where did you get your mojo, Moses? We're not seeing it. We're not seeing it. Life in the wilderness is hard. People starve to death out here. Now maybe it started out as an adventure, kind of a fascinating thing to see if they could pull this off. But after a while, the shine wears off. After a while, reality sinks in. We start to feel like Israel felt. We start talking like Israel was talking. Because we're afraid. Because we're frustrated. Because we're bored, because we're tired, because we're hungry, because out there in the wilderness where we can't take care of ourselves and the people we love the way we want to take care of them, we start getting anxious, we start getting uneasiness. And when we're out there in the wilderness where we can't really see how it's going to happen, we begin to wonder if God will take care of us. And pretty soon the wondering if becomes doubting that God will take care of us. In the story, you heard that God also got a little bit grumpy. God was getting kind of grumpy with these people. He had led them out into the wilderness, just like sometimes God leads us out into the wilderness, to teach us what we need to learn about trusting God. Out in the wilderness where we have to learn how to trust God. Except that trust on an empty belly often is not easy. Trust with a fearful heart is not easy. The good news, we heard it in the story, is that God doesn't give up on us, though. God does not leave us out there to starve. In ways that teach us how to trust, in ways that teach us how to obey, God sets out to provide for us. Here's what I'm going to do, God said in the story, and then God provided that whole batch of instructions about how much to gather, when to gather it, what happens on the 6th day, because of course the 7th day was the Sabbath day, the day when God and people and creation rest. So there wouldn't be any provision for the seventh day. But God had even thought of that ahead of time and explained to the people, here's what you do on the sixth day so that you can also survive the seventh day. And so in the evening, the quail would come up and cover the camp. The people would be able to butcher the meat and have meat to eat. And in the morning, when the dew would lift on the surface of the wilderness, the story said, was a fine, flaky substance as fine as frost on the ground. The people called it manna. Manna is the Hebrew word for, what in the world is this stuff anyway? Because nobody had ever seen anything like it, and nobody knew what it was. But it tasted like bread, and it digested like bread. So they had their carbohydrates at night. In the morning, they had their protein at night, and they were fed. Day after day after day they were fed. Turns out it was the same diet day after day after day, year after year after year for 40 years, which also then, if you remember the story as it unfolds, stirred up its own set of complaints because they got a little tired of that after 5 or 10 years. But that's the story. And the people remembered that story. They remembered it for generations. They remembered it some 1,500 years later after Jesus performs this miracle of turning the 5 loaves and the 2 fish into enough food to feed 5,000 people. They remembered this story, and they brought it up to Jesus' mind. This is why Jesus said the crowd came looking for him. They came looking for him not because they had seen some kind of sign that would help them try to understand who Jesus was, that Jesus was somehow special. They came looking for him because it was lunchtime. That's what Jesus said anyway, and maybe Jesus was right. But in any case, Jesus sees here a teaching moment, an opportunity to see if he could help the sign do its proper work. The sign of feeding the 5,000, the story that we read last Sunday. And you remember that John called it a sign. The other gospel writers, if they call it anything at all, they call it a miracle. John says it's a sign. A sign. And you know what signs do? Signs try to point something out to us, something we might miss if we didn't have the sign. What the name of the new street is that we wanted to turn on, or which store it is that we're coming up to as we drive down the block. A sign points something out to us. The sign by itself is not such a big deal. What matters is what the sign is trying to point out for us. So the free lunch wasn't the primary point. Seeing what the sign pointed out was the point. But the people were, at this point, missing the point. The crowd brings up to Jesus this Exodus manna story, the story we've been just reflecting on. They bring it up in order to kind of put Jesus in a box. Moses bought us lunch every day for 40 years. You claim to be better than Moses. Put your money where your mouth is, Jesus. Buy us lunch. Buy us lunch. Now, please understand, Jesus does care about our bodies. Jesus does care about us when times are difficult. Jesus does care about people who struggle. Jesus does want people to be fed. And that's why, among other things, churches participate in food pantry ministries and all that sort of thing as we become Jesus' hands and feet in the world, because Jesus does want people to be fed. But Jesus wants something more than that. Jesus wants for us something called eternal life. Eternal life. Eternal life is life that receives its qualities somehow from God. It isn't merely life that just goes on and on and on and on, day after day after day. That isn't its point, although, incidentally, eternal life does go on day after day after day, and year after year, and so on. But what eternal life is, more than anything else, is a life shaped by certain qualities. Qualities like goodness and grace and mercy and justice. Qualities like confidence in God's graciousness and of generosity, trust and hopefulness and peace and joy and gratitude. All of this is eternal life. And Jesus insists that we find this life that I've just described, with goodness and grace and mercy and justice and confidence in God's generosity and trust and hopefulness and peace and joy and gratitude. All of this eternal life, Jesus says, we find in relationship with Him. The Son of Man gives you the food that endures for eternal life, Jesus insists. The bread that came down from heaven to nourish you so long ago when you were in the wilderness, that came from the same God who sends me. And now I am the bread. I am the bread that nourishes your life. The life that you live in the wilderness of these days. I am the bread of life, Jesus tells them. I am the bread of life, Jesus tells us. I am the bread from heaven. I am the food that keeps you alive, even when times are hard, even when life is nasty, even when circumstances are grim, even when your journey into the wilderness takes you through the valley of the shadow of death. I am the bread of life. I am the bread that keeps you alive. You can trust me. You can depend on me. You can count on me. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, Jesus said. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. This is what Jesus says. How do we know that Jesus is telling the truth? What is the sign that Jesus gives us? Let me show you.